Again, my name is Gerard K. Cohen, and I am currently the engineering manager for the accessibility experience team at Twitter, where you can reach me at Gerard K. Cohen. You can also check out my website at gerardkcohen.me. And for those that want to follow along, the slides for this presentation are available online. You can follow along at bit.ly, so that's B as in boy, I as in India, T as in Tom, period, L as in Larry, Y as in yellow, / the number 3, V as in Victor, Z as in zebra, G as in George, capital G as in George, N as in Nancy, and the number 0. So I'll leave that on the screen there for a second. All right, so this presentation is mostly for new users of ARIA, and I'm basically going to be walking you through documentation and showing a few examples. But even if you have been using ARIA for a while, you might learn a few things. So here's my agenda for today. I'll start off first with a warning about the dangers of ARIA. From there, I'll do an introduction of the official ARIA standard, pointing out important sections, and then I'll get into the 5 rules of ARIA. The last important resource I'll go over today is the ARIA authoring practices, and I want to discuss their purpose and proper use. At that point, you should be pretty well introduced to ARIA and better equipped to create custom components. So I want to first talk about the dangers of ARIA and why it's important to know and use it right. So ARIA is very powerful and essential to providing the level of dynamics available in today's web. Using ARIA incorrectly can cause some serious barriers for users of assistive technologies. ARIA should be a last resort. Basically, it's just a way to fill in gaps that HTML has. So why is ARIA so troublesome? Well, besides people not taking the time to learn it properly, I would say one main reason is because ARIA support varies. There are a lot of hands in the pot by the time it reaches an assistive technology user. One thing to be aware of is that ARIA does not equal accessibility, right? So not to diminish the importance and impact of ARIA, but it's only one part of the overall accessibility and usability of your work. You're not accessible if all you did was just add ARIA, even if it's the most amazing ARIA ever, right? So unfortunately, ARIA is not always completely supported by both browsers and assistive technologies the same way. And with the ARIA that is supported, sometimes there are bugs in the implementation. What's frustrating is that it's different across all browser and assistive technology combinations. Something may work great in one combination, but not be implemented or function properly in another. Sometimes the implementations may break after originally working properly. It's the same as you would expect with any of the other web technologies. And unfortunately, there are no media queries that you could query for support like CSS or the ability to test for support with JS to provide a polyfill. The only thing you could do is test your work and provide workarounds. But you have to know what you're doing. Throwing ARIA at a problem is not always the solution. To prove that point, a survey of 1 million homepages by WebAIM in February of 2022 states that homepages with ARIA present average 70% more detected errors than those without ARIA. So the more that ARIA is used, the more errors were found on the page. So not only is throwing ARIA at a problem not a proper solution, you could be making things worse. So ARIA should only be used to fill in gaps that HTML does not provide. It should only be used when necessary. This is why there is a very popular sentiment in the community that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. The point here is that if you don't know how to really use ARIA, it's just better to leave it off. Thankfully, you're here today, and hopefully you'll learn enough to not contribute to making things worse. So if ARIA is dangerous, why am I here talking about it? So personally, I think that ARIA has a bad rap, and it might be a controversial statement to some, but I think it's excessively vilified, and I can certainly understand why. A lot of the negative sentiment is definitely warranted. I can't deny that. It can be easily misunderstood and abused and can do some serious damage to assistive technology users. I think it's much easier to just say don't use it than it is to properly explain it and learn it. But that's not really going to help anyone. At a certain point, HTML alone is not enough, and you'll need to reach for ARIA. Just like anything else, it's not perfect by any means, but you shouldn't be overly afraid of it, and you shouldn't avoid it. You definitely need to respect ARIA, and I recommend that you take the time to learn and understand it. So with that being said, let's get into the documentation. So the very first resource that I want to expose you to is the official ARIA standard itself. Normally, visiting the official standard or spec for any kind of web technology is reserved for the extremely academic types. And most of you have probably never really read the official ECMAScript standard, but I want you to treat the official ARIA standard as an API guide to get the most up-to-date information on available options. If you want to know what something means, I urge you to come here to the official ARIA standard first. So you can always get to the latest version of the standard by going to www.w3.org/tr/y, that's WAI-ARIA, ARIA, which I have on the screen now. The first thing you'll learn here is that ARIA actually stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is kind of a throwback to like really old internet terms. As of today, the latest version of the ARIA standard is 1.1. So make sure you bookmark this. If you want to do ARIA well, if you want to do ARIA right, you'll be referencing this a lot. The spec for ARIA 1.2 is further along in the spec standard process, so it doesn't hurt to check that out every once in a while. But when it comes to the spec, I don't expect you to read the whole thing, but there are a couple of sections that I want to point out to you right now that will serve as the basis for everything you will do related to ARIA from now on. The first section that I want to point out is on the screen now. It's section 5.3, which is the categorization of roles. This section lists the available roles that ARIA provides. What are roles? Well, roles are how you provide semantics to elements, and semantics are extremely important to accessibility. So what exactly are semantics? Well, semantics basically express what something is. And once you know what something is, then you know how to use it and what the expected result will be. For example, if I was to hand you an object and tell you it's a fork, you'll most likely know what it is and how it's to be used. So ARIA roles provide semantics, and the ARIA 1.1 standard provides 70 usable roles. That's the total list. You cannot make up your own roles. So let me repeat that. You cannot make up your own role. Of these 70 roles in version 1.1, only 29 of them are interactive widget roles. And I'm going to focus on those right now. These interactive roles are defined in section 5.3.2 widget roles and can be broken down into two groups, standalone and composite. First, standalone widgets either operate on their own or exist to be part of a composite widget. And there are 20 standalone widget roles that I'm highlighting on the screen now, some of which may be familiar to you already, like button, checkbox, or link. Again, when it comes to standalone widget roles, this is the complete set. You cannot make up your own. The next group of composite widget roles, the next group are composite widget roles, and these are essentially parent roles or containers for other standalone widget roles. And there is a very strict hierarchy when it comes to composite widgets. These have to be composed of very specific standalone roles, and often in a very particular order. In most cases, you cannot pick and choose which roles you use to compose a widget, since some standalone roles can only exist as a child or nested in one of these 9 composite widget roles that I have highlighted on the screen here. Let me repeat that. There is a very strict parent-child relationship between certain roles. So some roles can only be used as a child of a specific composite role. And this is extremely important to understand, especially with how easy certain UI libraries make it to use or to reuse components and render wherever necessary. So be very careful about how you nest components and roles, because you could be breaking your well-intended accessibility if you don't respect the parent-child relationship of roles. Detailed information on how to use roles and how to apply standalone versus composite roles can be found in the definitions for each role. Diving into the definition of roles, they all follow the same format. So on the screen now, I'm going to be using the button role definition as an example. Each role provides a definition and information on usage. In this case, for example, a button is defined as an input that allows for user-triggered actions when clicked or pressed. In addition to this description, helpful usage guidelines are also included. For button, this is information I'm highlighting that describes how buttons support ARIA pressed and is used to create toggle buttons. Take this time to read this information because it always provides additional information that may not be gleaned from the general template for definitions. After the definition of each role, we have a table of characteristics that will further help you in determining what you need to include or what is supported when using a particular role. The first section to point out is the base concept section. Not all roles will have this, but this is your first clue that the semantics provided by this role can be provided by an equivalent HTML element. For the ARIA role of button, the base concept is an HTML button. When you see this, I highly recommend that you move on to using the HTML equivalent that is listed here instead of the ARIA role. After the base concept is this finite list of supported and inherited states and properties. I'll go over states and properties in a little bit, but the important thing to remember here is that these are the only states and properties that can be used on this role. For button, there are only two explicitly supported states. That's ARIA expanded and ARIA pressed. After the explicit list of supported states and properties is the inherited states and properties. These are all also supported by the role, but they are, as described, inherited from a superclass role. So this collection of supported and inherited states and properties are the only states and properties that this role supports. If you apply a state or a property that is not on this list of supported states and properties, then you're breaking accessibility. The next set of information has to do with the accessible name, letting you know if an accessible name is required and what that accessible name is calculated from. Accessible names for interactive controls especially are extremely important because they identify a widget. This is how assistive technology users know what they're interacting with. In the case of a button, the accessible name comes from the contents of the button. Speaking of the contents, pay attention to this last item here, which is the children presentational section. This is another clue to let you know what is allowed to nest inside of this element. If this is true, it basically means that content inside of this is stripped of any semantics. So if you nested links inside of a button or headings like I recently did, you're breaking accessibility. Now, a few more important sections I want to point out related to specific composite roles. If you remember when talking about composite roles, I told you that composite roles have a very specific parent-child hierarchy. The role definitions give you this information, and it's listed in required own elements in the section of required own elements of the characteristics table. Essentially, these are the required child role elements for this role. And not all roles will have this section. In this case, on the screen, I'm displaying the menu role definition. The required own elements here let you know that the menu role will require at least one instance of an element with one of these roles. Again, these are children that will be expected for this role. And if you're missing any of these elements listed in the required own elements, you're breaking accessibility. On the flip side, you also get information on the required parent role for a particular element. And this is documented in the required context role section in the table of characteristics. And on the screen right now, I'm showing the menu item role definition as an example. And the required parent role for menu item is one of group, menu, or menu bar. If you are using the menu item role and it is not nested in any one of these roles, you're breaking accessibility. So that's a very high level overview of how the spec define roles, how you can use this information when specifying roles for your ARIA components. And one thing I want to make you aware of when using roles. Roles do not provide interaction. They simply just describe what something is, but do not provide the expected behavior. You need to provide the interaction. And once you tell someone what something is, they'll know how to use it. So you need to provide the expected interaction. It's important to know that certain roles can change input modes for various assistive technologies. So specific interactions are expected. For example, a specific role may change what is expected of the arrow keys, and you need to provide that. When you don't provide those interactions, then you're breaking the contract established by the role. So it's the example that I like to use here. If you ask me for a screwdriver and I hand you a fork. Along with providing semantics by way of roles, ARIA also provides states and properties to further describe interfaces to assistive technologies. And as of ARIA 1.1, there are a total of 48 states and properties. So let's take a look at these available states and properties. Back to the official ARIA standard at section 6.6, which is the definition of states and properties. All the available states and properties with their available values are listed here. So just like the roles, you cannot make up your own states and properties or provide your own values. You can only use these 48. Again, you cannot make up your own states and properties. And along with not being able to make up your own, there are rules about which states and properties you can apply to specific roles. Some states and properties are required on certain roles, and some states and properties are not supported or allowed on other roles. Looking at ARIA expanded on the screen as an example of definitions for a state or property, you'll see that the format is the same as role definitions. It basically starts off with a description and some usage guidelines. And just like roles, each state and property definition includes a table of characteristics. Here's the used in roles section, and we see all the roles that support this particular state. As a confirmation, I see that button is listed. That matches the supported states we saw for button earlier. So if you use this state on a role that is not listed here, then you are breaking accessibility. After the characteristics table, you have a table documenting the available values for this state. For example, ARIA expanded accepts a true or false value, where true means it is expanded and false means it is collapsed. These are the only values that you can use for this state. If you use something other than the values listed here, you're breaking accessibility. So understanding roles, states, and properties, understanding the relationships between them, and knowing when and where to apply them is everything for proper ARIA usage. What I've shown you here is how to use the specs when creating your custom components. Again, this documentation is replete with everything you need to understand how things work together. And that's a big part of understanding ARIA, but there's still a few more resources that I want to go over that will complete your initiation into ARIA. So when it comes to ARIA, there are 5 very well-established rules that you need to be aware of. And these high-level rules will always guide you in making the right decision when you're developing your own ARIA widgets. The first rule of ARIA might as well be the only rule because it is repeated so often. If you have already started on your journey in ARIA, then you may have heard this one already. The first rule is don't use ARIA. Now, this may remind you of some sort of Fight Club rule, and ARIA can cause a lot of fights, definitely, but if you're confused by this rule, it's because it's not totally accurate. This is actually an incomplete rule and statement that we use all the time. The entire rule to be aware of is don't use ARIA if you can use HTML instead. The second part is almost always left off, but it is really important. As I mentioned in the overview of the ARIA standard, ARIA is used to describe widget role, semantics, and state. And a lot of this is covered by existing HTML elements and properties. So instead of role equals banner, you should be using the header tag. Instead of role equals complementary, use the aside tag. Role of button is the same as the button tag, just like role of link is the same as the A or anchor tag. And instead of using role equals navigation, just use the nav tag. As I mentioned earlier, if there's an HTML equivalent to an ARIA role, you should always prioritize using HTML. HTML can provide semantics, focusability, and interaction. And if you can use the HTML counterpart first, and it's supported by browsers and assistive technologies, then you're better off just using the HTML, as it will provide all the same properties as ARIA while providing a more stable experience. Simply by using the right HTML element, you get semantics, the focusability, and interaction already built in. It's less work for you and less code, and less of a surface area for bugs in the experience. This is exactly why accessibility professionals stress learning HTML so much. It does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And I know it's easier than it sounds since there's a lot of HTML elements to choose from. It could be hard to know when to use HTML versus ARIA. So I'm currently working on a periodic table of semantics. So on the screen, I have an example of this periodic table of semantics, and it lists every HTML element available, and it matches to an ARIA role. So if you need to provide semantics, you can easily find out if there's an HTML element you can use. And if it's not, then you can fill in the gap using ARIA. I'm still working on this, and I've been working on it for a long time, but all the data is there with links to each of the official specs. And you can find this periodic table of semantics at bit.ly/2, I as in India, capital M as in Mary, capital K as in King, the number 1, lowercase k, lowercase o as in Oscar. Second rule of ARIA is don't change native semantics. If you're being responsible and using HTML first, you have to make sure that you don't use ARIA to replace the semantics of that native element. You see, when you use an ARIA role, you are explicitly setting the semantics of the element. The ARIA role takes precedence over the HTML. So let me show you an example. Let's say your site or application has a collapsed menu and you're using a link because it's easy to style it and also natively provides focusability, which you heard was good for accessibility. You provide a click handler to prevent the default behavior of making the page jump when the link is used, and then you display your menu. At some point, you learn that links are meant for navigation only, and you should really use a button for this. But you don't want to have to modify or markup your markup or your CSS. And you also just learned about ARIA roles and how they provide semantics. So you decide to just add the role of button to this anchor tag. Now, this menu is communicated to assistive technologies as a button, and you're happy. So what is the problem with adding the role in this way? Well, as you've already learned, roles specify semantics, and semantics are a contract. The element needs to behave as expected for the role, but links don't act the same as buttons. See, links are activated using the enter key, and buttons are activated using the space key. You've told the user that this is a button, and they will try to use the space key, but nothing will happen. You've broken the contract. So to fix this, you decide to add additional JavaScript to restore the contract. And now technically in the assistive technology might smooth over the usage of space versus enter, but that really shouldn't change the guidance here. At this point, considering all the work you had to do to fix that situation, hopefully you realize that it would have been easier to just use a button. Again, if you use HTML as intended, the platform will provide a lot for you, including semantics and interaction. You then use ARIA to fill in the gaps as necessary. Hopefully the third rule of ARIA should be familiar to you already. Basically, all interactive ARIA roles need to be operable by keyboard. If functionality is provided via mouse, touch, or any other method of input, it also needs to be available by keyboard. This is important in fulfilling the contract of semantics. Keyboard support is absolutely fundamental for accessibility support. Ensuring keyboard support will get you a long way with other input modalities as well, like game controllers, for example. The reason for that is because a lot of additional input modalities actually use keyboard APIs under the hood. So if you can support keyboards very well, it leaves you open to supporting any other type of input modalities. The fourth rule of ARIA is don't use role equals presentation or ARIA hidden true on visible focus elements. Now, to break this down, the role of presentation is a very special role. It basically removes the semantics of an element. If you do this to an interactive or focusable element, then an assistive technology user will not know what it is or how to use it. And this could be a serious barrier. ARIA hidden is an ARIA state that effectively hides the element from assistive technology users. So if you remember me saying ARIA just described things, it does not affect appearance or functionality the way HTML attributes might. When you use ARIA hidden true on an element, it's still rendered and visible on the screen. But doing this on a visible interactive element hides that element, which can, again, create a serious barrier to your users. Proper ways to hide elements is a completely separate conversation, but for now, just know that role equals presentation and ARIA hidden true can be very dangerous if not fully understood and supported properly. The fifth and last rule of ARIA is that all interactive elements must have an accessible name. And why is this important? Well, if semantics or role gives you the type, then accessible name tells you what. And not only is this important for screen reader and Braille users, it's also important for voice recognition users to be able to identify and interact with controls on a page. So make sure that all interactive elements have an accessible name. The 5 rules of ARIA are documented here on the W3 site at www.w3.org/tr/ARIA-in-HTML. And you can read up on more information and examples. There's some other really good information documented on this page, and I encourage you to check it out to learn more. So up to this point, I've gone over a lot of documentation and principles. Now it's time to get into some specific examples of implementing ARIA. And when it comes to creating custom components, you don't always have to start from scratch. There are some established examples you can use to start off with. Another important resource that I want to discuss here are the official ARIA authoring practices. And this resource is often referred to as an example of proper ARIA implementation for various widgets. The authoring practices are available at www.w3.org/tr/Y, that's WAI-ARIA-practices. And they demonstrate about 29 different widgets and patterns. Some are essentially ARIA recreations of HTML elements like button and checkbox, but some of them are interactive widgets that are only available via ARIA, like tabs. I'm going to use the accordion as an example. Now, each pattern starts off with some information about the general purpose and usage, which can include variations on the pattern. I'm going to skip over the example for right now and go over to the keyboard interaction section. Included with each pattern is the expected keyboard interaction, which describes each interactive element with the expected keys to implement and the expected result of activating those keys. For example, with the accordion, when focus is on an accordion header, enter or space should essentially toggle whether or not the accordion is expanded. Expectations for tab and shift tab, as well as optional controls like up and down arrows or home or and end, are also included. After the keyboard section is a section that lists all the necessary ARIA roles, states, and properties for the pattern. Everything you need to know in terms of implementing this pattern is listed here. Now, to experience this in real life, let's go back to the example that is provided here. All of the examples follow the same outline. They start off with some links at the top, a brief introduction on the examples being demonstrated and how the pattern is being implemented. And I'll go back to these links in a bit. After that is a live working implementation of the pattern that you can play with and test. Following that is keyboard support that is implemented in this specific example. And again, this breaks down all the expected keys that are implemented and the expected interactions. And then there's more a more detailed description of the roles, states, and properties, and the tab index used in the pattern. This is like a mapping of HTML elements to ARIA roles and attributes used in the example. To round out the example are links to the CSS and JavaScript files and the markup being used. So maybe you're thinking about skipping the rest of this presentation and just copying the examples here since everything is done already. Well, not so fast, right? These authoring practices are often used in a way that are not originally intended and often used incorrectly. Let me point out some important notices in the documentation. In the very beginning, I talked about these links at the top, and I want to point out some things mentioned in the browser and assistive technology support page. It states, testing assistive technology interoperability is essential before using code from this guide in production, because the purpose of this guide is to illustrate appropriate use of ARIA 1.1 as defined in the ARIA specification. The design patterns, reference examples, and sample code intentionally do not describe and implement coding techniques for working around problems caused by gaps in support for ARIA 1.1 in browsers and assistive technologies. It is thus advisable to test implementations thoroughly with each browser and assistive technology combination that is relevant within a target audience. It goes on to say, except in cases where the ARIA working group and other contributors have overlooked an error, examples in this guide that do not function well in a particular browser or with a specific assistive technology are demonstrating browser or assistive technology bugs. Browser and assistive technology developers can thus utilize code in this guide to help assess the quality of their support for ARIA 1.1. And that's from the ARIA authoring practices document, section 2.2, browser and assistive technology support, with some added emphasis by me. So what does this all mean? What this is saying is that they don't provide any guidance as how to work around bugs in browsers or assistive technology. And these guides provide the state at which they would like things to be supported. It's a testing tool basically for browsers and AT vendors to help beef up support if something is not working. The truth of the matter is that ARIA is only a spec, and there's no guarantee that browser vendors or assistive technologies are going to support all the roles, states, and properties. Just the same way building codes do not always guarantee that something is built properly into code. Because of this, they advise testing everything before using. One more thing I want to point out here. Currently, this guide does not include which examples are compatible with mobile browsers or touch interfaces. While some of the examples include specific features that enhance mobile and touch support, some ARIA features are not supported in any mobile browser. In addition, there is not yet a standardized approach for providing touch interactions that work across mobile browsers. And that's from the ARIA authoring practices document, section 2.3, mobile and touch support. And this is basically an acknowledgement that these patterns and the ARIA used to build them may not be supported by mobile browsers. In fact, the design patterns did not even really take mobile and touch into consideration. This is obviously future work to be done. Now, up until recently, these notices were tucked away in the spec documentation, but now all the examples have recently added this call out here that I'm highlighting on the screen, titled Important Note About Use of This Example. If you expand this content, you'll see the information that I just read is summarized, so take notice of this. Now, I see a lot of component libraries advertise they're accessible because they implement the ARIA authoring practices. Just be aware that it doesn't always guarantee accessibility. Things absolutely must be tested. So what are you supposed to do? I'm not telling you that you can't use these patterns. You can certainly use them as a basis for your widgets, but you shouldn't use them as is. The point of all this is test, test, test. Everything that you do, and not just on your own, hopefully with real users. You'll discover some inconsistencies, and you will be expected to fill in those gaps on your own. That's why it's important to know and understand ARIA, not just copy and paste these patterns. The ARIA spec calls this out explicitly in the testing practices and tools section by saying, the accessibility of interactive content cannot be conferred by static checks alone. Developers of interactive content should test for device-independent access to widgets and applications, and should verify accessibility API access to all content and changes during user interaction. And this is from the ARIA authoring practices document, section 1.5.2 for testing practices and tools. So just another prompt to make sure that you're actually testing with assistive technologies and not just relying on the inclusion of ARIA to ensure accessibility. Another thing I want to mention is that since this is basically an ARIA testbed, a lot of times they will excessively use ARIA roles and properties that are perfectly available via HTML. This is not a suggestion or example to always use ARIA instead of HTML, but in order to test ARIA, they have to use the ARIA. So again, I'm not saying you shouldn't use this resource. I'm just emphasizing that you need to test everything yourself. You should definitely follow the keyboard interaction and start with the roles and properties demonstrated, but experiment with falling back to using HTML first, and then make sure you test everything with assistive technologies. So in summary, don't be afraid to use ARIA. Familiarize yourself with the specs and learn how to use them properly. Use only what is needed to fill in HTML gaps. Mastering ARIA is not just about how to use it, but more importantly, when not to use it. And no matter what you do, make sure you test everything. So again, ARIA can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Remember, ARIA is better than no ARIA is better than bad ARIA, but at least now you know how to use the spec to understand how everything works together. ARIA is finite. There are only 70 roles and 48 states and properties. You cannot make up your own. There are also strict rules around parent-child relationships for roles. Again, use the standards to understand relationships. ARIA only describes content via roles, states, or properties. It does not magically add functionality. That is up to you. Keep in mind that adding ARIA roles may change assistive technology input modes, and usage of certain keys will be expected. You need to provide that interaction. That's why it's best to learn HTML and prioritize it whenever possible. Use HTML over ARIA will almost always give you a more reliable experience. I also showed you that the ARIA authoring practices, with a caveat, that they are not meant to be copy and pasted. The primary purpose of those examples are to provide a testbed to browser and assistive technology vendors to provide better ARIA support. They're still a good reference to start, but they're not an end. Ultimately, you need to test everything for proper support and functionality. Don't be afraid of ARIA. Familiarize yourself with the specs and learn how to use them properly. Use only what is needed to fill in HTML gaps. And remember, mastering ARIA is not just about how you use it, but more importantly, when not to use it. And at this point, you can consider yourself initiated, but this is only the beginning. Before I go, I just want to take this opportunity to shamelessly plug and quickly let you know that I do have some accessibility courses available on the Pluralsight Learning platform, which are part of the developing websites for accessibility path. So if you want to learn more about accessibility, specifically with an engineering focus, you could check out my courses, Meeting Web Accessibility Guidelines, which includes ARIA 2.1, Introduction to Develop Custom Components with ARIA, which is basically the advanced version of this presentation. And lastly, accessibility testing and screen reader use. And if you're interested in learning more from me, you could check these out over at Pluralsight. And with that, I want to say thank you for attending, and thank you to Tech Access Oklahoma for allowing me to speak today. I hope you can feel more comfortable about ARIA. Again, these slides are available at bit.ly, number 3, V as in Victor, Z as in Zebra, G as in George, capital G as in George, N as in Nancy, 0. And if you have any questions or comments or feedback, you can reach me at Gerard K. Cohen on Twitter. So we have some time for some questions. And if not, have a great rest of the day.
All right. Hi, Gerard.
Hello.
So yeah, we've got a couple of good questions here in the Q&A. And so Ashley Clayton asks, so basically you don't want to make up your own ARIA and you want to try to follow the documentation to the letter, correct?
Yes, so you definitely can, as I mentioned multiple times, you cannot make up your own ARIA roles or states and properties. You have to be very careful about how you apply states and properties to specific roles. And you also have to respect the parent-child hierarchy. So definitely follow along with the spec itself. The spec and the table of characteristics that I highlighted is your best resource to find out where to start. After that, you want to actually test with assistive technologies to make sure that things work the way you expect them to and the way your users expect them to.
Great, and that actually kind of leads into the next question. Michelle asks, do you have any recommendations for the best assistive tech to use to test with?
Ooh, that's there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is, start with the platform that you have in front of you. If you're on Windows, test with with the JAWS screen reader. And specifically, try to stick with browsers like Chrome or Microsoft Edge, which, under the hood are the same. JAWS, obviously, there's a cost associated with it. So you can also use NVDA. I recommend testing that using Firefox. And you can also jump over to Chrome to figure out any inconsistencies. If you're on a mobile device, obviously mobile devices on iOS, you have VoiceOver to test with. And on an Android, you have TalkBack. So use any combination of those. Also on Mac as well, you have VoiceOver that I suggest testing specifically with Safari. You may run into issues if you're using Safari and testing on Chrome or any other browser. So I recommend sticking with Safari. That will give you the best support. So any of those in combination is great to start. If you can do as many of those as possible, that's really the best thing, because again, support for ARIA depends on the combination that you're using. So do as much as you can using any of those combinations.
Great, great. Melissa asks, using Browser Stack currently for testing, but what are some good options for implementing testing with AT? That kind of answered that a little bit already, but do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so obviously, if you don't have all those platforms and assistive technologies that I just mentioned, which a lot of people just don't have access to, I understand. If you want to do a really good job, again, start with the platform that you have and try to use the actual platform and the assistive technology for that browser and platform combination. After that, there's actually there's a really cool website that I've used, and this is not a direct endorsement. I'm not affiliated with them, but I believe it's Assistive Labs. Actually gives you the ability to virtually test in those combinations. So they do have access to a Windows machine that you can test NVDA, with Firefox. If you have a valid license for JAWS, you can also test JAWS in that virtual environment. And I do believe that they have some other platforms as well. So if you're in the virtual side of things, you can try out Assistive Labs, which is browser-based, obviously. A lot of times, since my main development machine is my Mac, what I do is I actually so I'm able to test on my Mac. I'm able to test Safari and VoiceOver because that's built in. But I also use a virtual PC to install, just a running version of Windows. And with that, I'll test JAWS with Chrome or Microsoft Edge, and then also NVDA with Firefox, which is an option as well. But one thing you have to be careful with in that virtual environment is that the keyboard interaction changes when you go from your host machine into the virtualized PC. So you may have to test with some different keyboard settings. And if you want more information about that, just reach out to me on Twitter, and I could help you with that.
Great. Carrie asks, what is the most common mistake you see with improper use of ARIA?
Oh, wow. Most common, there's a few. Using incorrect roles and then using nesting roles improperly are probably the biggest things. So, I briefly mentioned with a lot of UI libraries that make it easy to render things wherever you need to. A lot of times what I'll see someone, with specific libraries do is maybe they render a menu. And then inside of the menu, that maybe they use another library component to render maybe a modal or a balloon or something like that. That looks visually like it's not attached to that menu at all, but actually because of the way it was implemented, it renders within, for example, that menu role. And like I said earlier, is you have to really respect the parent-child hierarchy of the way you're nesting roles. So that's probably one of the biggest problems, most common that I see. Other than that is just using the wrong roles and making up roles is another thing. And then I've seen a role equals hamburger menu, which doesn't exist. A lot of people, what does that even mean? So though I'd say off the top of my head, those are the three most common ARIA issues.
Great. Jeanette asks, is ARIA better used for mobile app support rather than websites consumed on a computer?
No, so there's always going to be better support on browser-based implementations on a full-blown machine, so either a laptop or a desktop computer, and that's just because there's history there, right? Like those things have existed for what, 25 years maybe. I think the web's like 25 years, maybe a couple years older, so the support is always going to be better there. Mobile usage, mobile browsers, again, we're still relatively new in that area, so the support isn't going to be as great, but that's a level of specificity that I don't think you should really worry about, to be honest. You start with what you can and use what is expected based on the specs, and then you'll find out that the mobile screen readers and mobile browsers for the most part, work in describing things. It usually comes around problems with the mobile browsers usually happens around interactions because it's very hard to translate very specific keyboard interactions to swipes. And even just listening for swipe events and translating that into actions is very difficult on mobile platforms. So, but again, don't split hairs over, should I use ARIA only for mobile versus, desktop, computer, web. Just use what you can when you can, and you'll get some pretty good support anyways.
Great. And so along those same lines, Melissa was wondering if you expect mobile support for ARIA to change sooner than later.
Yeah, hopefully sooner. There's obviously, it's recognized in the community and as a big gap, not only within ARIA, but also within WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as well. Again, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is like 20 years old, right? So the name even is a throwback to, past times with web content accessibility, but definitely there's work being done every day to better implement support for mobile applications and browsers.
Great. Okay, and looks like we have just one final question here. Just encourage people to go ahead and send in additional questions if they have any. But Kristen asks, where in the development cycle do you add or assess for ARIA when writing the HTML, in design?
I'll give kind of a generic response that relates to just accessibility in general. A lot of times we like to say that the best time to implement accessibility is at the beginning. The next best time is right now. So for me personally, just because I've been doing it for so long, it's not because I'm like a genius. I just have muscle memory of doing it wrong for so many years and trying to get it right. Is I just do it as I'm coding. Like it's just part of muscle memory for when I'm writing tags. Ideally, it's overall in a larger sense, it's a shared responsibility. So hopefully your designs that you're getting, if you're working with the designer, hopefully they provide the intentions for you in the designs rather than just providing pixels arranged in a certain way. So hopefully they'll give you some clues as to this is a button, this is a link, this is a menu, and you could translate that into the implementation. Or if you have a design system, for example, maybe that stuff's already built in for you. But really, it's kind of a shared responsibility. If we're focusing just on engineering and development, like just do it at the beginning, because trying to add it, and this is the same for accessibility in general, but trying to add it after the fact may cause you some heartache. So as early as possible and as often as possible, you want to do it.
Yeah, it looks like we have one final question from Brent. And he asks, with the momentum behind Web3 and the metaverse, have you seen movement toward accessibility in that arena? And if so, does ARIA have a place there?
That's a great question. Historically, cutting edge technologies usually leaves out accessibility. There are some people that are working really hard in the VR space to make sure it's included, because VR can be an amazing assistive technology and can really open up a lot of things for people with disabilities. So there are people that are working to make sure that that's included as everything is being built. Web3 is still very early in a lot of different ways. That I don't think they're really thinking of accessibility. It's more kind of architecture and you show me a proper Web3 implementation and I'll tell you if it's successful or not. But if you're in that space and you're excited about those technologies, take what you know here and try to apply it there. So don't wait for other people to do it, because nobody's really doing it right now, to be honest. So we need people like yourself, Brent, that are interested in those technologies and also interested in accessibility to bridge the gap and make sure that we're not left behind. Because one of the problems that we have, why accessibility is so horribly supported, is because it's not thought of at the beginning. So a lot of times decisions are made 10 years ago that make it absolutely impossible to add accessibility, or add accessibility without trying to rip out everything that was done before. So again, the best time to do it is at the beginning. So just keep that in mind as you're working on those technologies.
Great. Okay, it looks like we had one additional question come in, but I also want to respect everyone's time and give everybody a break. Yeah. And so just kind of as a final final thing here, Marcia was wondering if you have any additional resources or course suggestions for learning ARIA.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia, for the question. I mean, if you could stand the technical language, like I said, the spec is the best place and the first place you should go to. Everything is listed there in the official spec for each role and property. Go back over the slides to give you, the cues and sections to pay attention to. If you're looking for more specific instructional material, I'd have to be a little proud and say that I'm very happy about the course that I have on Pluralsight for creating custom components with ARIA. I really, again, that's more of an advanced version of the presentation I gave you today here, where I really go in depth about the specs and then also go through specific examples and creating a custom component and showing you from start to finish. You have this idea of something you want to build. Let me check the spec to see how I could build it, and then just follow along. So I would suggest you check that out on Pluralsight. Pluralsight, for obviously it's a commercial learning platform. They do provide a 10-day trial for free, which 10 days, if you're dedicated, is more than enough time to get through the 3 courses that I have there. On the short end, they're an hour and a half. On the long end, they're 3 hours. So within 10 days, if you're dedicated, you could probably get through those within the free trial period.